looking at that burning bush. His mission had just been put before him. The more he listened, the more he realized this was a mission impossible. As God spoke, he was afraid. He was afraid to even go near the bush. Remember, the voice said, "Take off your shoes. You're on holy ground." Here he was just a shepherd. And here was a voice speaking from this bush. Genesis 3:6 tells us, as God spoke, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. We know that a few years down the road, he asked God if he could see him. "Can I look at you?" But here, he wasn't there. He hid his face because he was afraid. As Moses received his mission, if he chose to accept it, God told Moses about the Israelite slaves, the POWs, that were being held by Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Now, as Moses listened to this mission, he was really scared. He was really scared. Matter of fact, that's why he was there today watching over those sheep out in the mountains. He had escaped Egypt to get away from this Pharaoh that was holding his people captive. Let's pray. Father, today I ask you to open our hearts and our minds that we might be drawn into your presence and that you might be here with us. In Jesus' name, amen. If you remember, Moses was on the run. You ever had to be on the run? No, I haven't either, but I've thought about it a few times when my mom got that hickory switch. You know, I've told you about the hickory switch. You know, our right hand was paralyzed from getting bit by a rattlesnake in a church service. We don't have any of those here today. But when she come out of the coma, her hand was paralyzed, and it just left a little opening. She could just barely wiggle her fingers a little bit. But man, that opening was a perfect size to get a hickory switch in. And there was times I thought about running. But I knew I'd have to come back eventually because I like to eat. And I knew it would catch up with me. I never escaped one of those whoopings. Now here Moses was up in the mountains on the run. He was no longer in Egypt. If you remember, he had tried to stand up for these prisoners of war, these Israelite slaves. And they didn't recognize him as someone who could lead them out of captivity. When word got out from the prisoners, it found its way to the guards and then to Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh had gone against his upbringing. You see, Moses was one of the prisoners. He was an Israelite slave, just like all the rest of them. If you recall the story, the Pharaoh had said, "Hey, they're getting too many for us." And they said, "Throw all the baby boys into the Nile." And Moses was one of these baby boys that got put into the Nile. Now, I think the Nile's got crocodiles and all kind of stuff out there. And even the basket that he got put in could have very easily been devoured. But God was watching over him, and he calls the Pharaoh's daughter to come and find him. Y'all know the story. And she took him and had adopted him. He'd been adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, and he was being groomed to be the next Pharaoh of Egypt. He had gone to all the best schools, learned to speak all the language, and to be wise in all sorts of things. The only problem was Moses knew who he was. You know, sometimes as Christians, we go off out in the world and do things that we shouldn't be doing. Sometimes God has to remind us who we are, where we should be. And that's what this series has been about, calling back those people that have forgotten who they are and remind them who they are. And the problem was, Moses, even after all of this teaching, all this grooming, he knew that these were his people that were prisoners, slaves. And he could see that the people were being mistreated. These were his people. These were God's chosen people, the Israelite family. The family had grown. They'd been in Egypt for 400 years. God had prophesied that they would be there for 400 years. And the time had come to end that. How could anyone treat God's chosen people like that? Back in my Sabbath school class, we've been studying the history of the church. If you've never studied the history of the church, get the Great Controversy out and start reading about the history of the church, or the Fox's Book of Martyrs, and see what was done to God's chosen people. It was so bad that we just read a few weeks ago that the papacy had hired or initiated the French to destroy Christians. And they sent news to the papacy that they had destroyed 70,000 of the Christians at one whack. And it said that the papal church was so enthusiastic about it, and was so pleased that they threw a banquet and a party to celebrate that 70,000 of these heretic Christians had been killed. They were excited about it. Hebrews 11:24 tells us by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of the Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. There was a reward, right? His fathers had been promised from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, on down, had been promised a reward. And that's what Hebrews 11 is talking about. All these people that have been promised this reward had not received it, because they've all died, they've all returned to dust, and they're there in their graves or their tombs, awaiting the rest of us. Hebrews 11 says they'll be there, and they have not received their reward. because it's going to be a better reward, because we're all going to receive it together. Those that have died, along with those that are left alive, we will all receive that reward together. And Moses is one of those that's going to come out of the grave at the second coming. Moses is one of them. Well, actually, the Bible says that God come back and already resurrected Moses. But all the other patriarchs there mentioned are resting in their grave. Waiting for us to finish the mission that he set out on. To free God's people. As you remember, Moses saw the injustice being done to God's chosen people. If you remember, he saw one of the Egyptian guards mistreating one of his people. Saw him being beaten unmerciful, and he stepped in. As you recall, he killed the guard who was mistreating the man. Later on, Moses tried to break up a fight between two of God's people, stop them from fighting. And one of them smarted off to Moses. Remember what he said? So, are you going to kill me too, like you did the Egyptian? Uh-oh. When Moses heard this, he knew word had got out. Somebody had saw him kill that Egyptian. And he knew what was going to happen. But he heard something even more than this. What he heard was God's chosen people didn't want to be rescued. They didn't want him standing up for them. They wanted him to just leave them alone. Exodus 2:11, let's read that. One day after Moses has grown up, he went out where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me like you did the Egyptian?" And Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." Now when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to Midian. When he got to Midian, he sat down by a well. Now the priest of the Midian had 7 daughters. Now while Moses was sitting there, these 7 girls showed up at the well to draw water, to fill the troughs to water their father's sheep. And as Moses was sitting there watching, some shepherds came and they chased the girls away. But you knowing Moses, what does he do when he sees an injustice done? He steps in. He couldn't just sit there and watch those girls being mistreated. So he got up and he came to the rescue. And of course, being the gentleman he was, he drew water for their sheep and flock. Now, when these girls got back home, their father, Reuel, asked them, "How'd you get back so early today?" And they told him about Moses, how he had rescued them from the shepherds. They said he even drew water to water the sheep for us, the flock. And Reuel said, "Where is he? Well, he's still at the well. Why did you leave him there? Go. Invite him to come eat with us. Now they went and got Moses and they brought him back. And Moses ended up staying with Reuel's family. And while living there, he married Zipporah, one of Reuel's daughters. And Moses stayed there in Midian, and he started a family of his own. He just settled in. Now, while Moses was living in Midian, the king of Egypt, who was after Pharaoh, after Moses, he died. But God's chosen people, they were still there. They were still being mistreated, abused. And the Israelites were groaning and crying out to God for help because their slavery was bad. And it went up before God. And this is where we found Moses. As Moses stood there barefooted talking to God in that burning bush, he said, "You want me to do what? Go back to Egypt? Lord, you don't understand. I know those people. And the sad thing is, they know me, and they want to kill me. You want me to go back behind enemy lines to rescue those people that are being held captive there? Lord, you know these people. I tried to help them, and what they do, they turn me into Pharaoh." And Lord, you know I've been gone from there for 40 years. I'm no longer fluent in the language. I can still speak it a little bit, but I fumble with it, and I'm not fluent in the speech. I haven't been there for 40 years. How am I supposed to do this? God told Moses, said, "Go find your older brother Aaron, who's still living there in Egypt, and he will interpret for you." Here Moses faced two missions. The first one, he had to go back and convince Pharaoh to let God's chosen people go. Mission number 2, he had to convince God's chosen people of who they were. Because over the past 400 years, they had just settled into Egypt. And if it hadn't been for the mistreatment of the guards and the Pharaoh, they would have just been pleased to just stay there and live their life and raise their family. They had forgotten they were God's chosen people. They had forgotten about His laws. If you remember when Moses finally read them out of Egypt, God reestablished His commandments with Moses. And you remember what He said there on the 4th commandment? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. They had forgotten it. Over 400 years it was gone. I would say, being a slave, you didn't get Sabbath off, right? You couldn't say, "Oh, it's Friday night, it's sundown, it's the Sabbath, and I'm not making any bricks today." Annette just finished up a story here at Storytime. You remember what it was called? The 7-Day Ox, about Nikolai who refused to work on the Sabbath, and they kept putting him in a box, and he would stay in that box, and finally they'd take him out after 5 or 6 days, and they'd take him a few days so he could even straighten up, because he couldn't even straighten up in the box. just in time to get his strength back before he told them he wasn't working Sabbath again, and they put him back in the box. You remember the story? It went on and on for, how many years did you say it went on? A bunch, like 7 years or so. It was a bunch of years. Anyone remember how many years it was? It went on for a long time. And one of the prison executives come there, and this was in Siberia, in Russia, where it gets extremely cold. And he found out that the guard, or the officer, had Nikolai in that box, and he made him get him out. And they give Nikolai another job of getting water, and they told him that if he would gather enough water for 7 days, in only 6 days, he could have the Sabbath off. And if you remember, that ox just would not go. Maxim just would not pull that cart, and he got down to Friday and still didn't have, all he could get was enough water for the day. This ox was old and lazy and slow. But Friday morning, that ox was up and bellowing. They hooked him to the cart, and he ran back and forth from the spring over and over, and it was hard for Nikolai to even keep up with him. And they got enough water in for Nikolai to have the Sabbath off. And this went on for a long time. And even after Nikolai was released from prison, the ox did the same thing. It kept keeping Sabbath to the people that were getting water after him. It was real slow for up to Friday, and then it ran, and then on Sabbath they couldn't get that ox to do nothing. He wouldn't go to that spring no matter what. But they had forgotten about the Sabbath. They had forgotten who they were. They had forgotten that they were God's chosen people. In Exodus 5, we find God's chosen people there angry. They were angry at Moses. You know what he had done? They were really angry at Moses because he had went to the Pharaoh on their behalf and asked Pharaoh to let him go. Now, you've all heard the story in Exodus 5. After Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival and worship me in the desert." Pharaoh said, "Who is this God that I should obey him and let Israel go?" Well, that was the wrong thing to say. "I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Now, that same day, the Pharaoh, skipping down to verse 6, now the same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and the foremen in charge of the people. "You are to no longer supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number as bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota." They're lazy, and that is why they're crying out, "Let us go and sacrifice to our God." Make the work harder for the men, so that when they keep working, they pay no attention to this man's lies. And this is what the slave drivers did. And God's people were really distressed over this. They weren't angry at Pharaoh and the guards. Who were they angry at? Moses. They were angry at Moses. Why? They had forgotten who they were. They had forgotten God. They had forgotten that 400 years before, he had promised that he would lead them out with a mighty hand. We've talked a little bit in the revival meetings about these plagues or these curses that were brought on Egypt. That's what they were, right? They were brought on Egypt, not God's people. They were brought on Egypt, these curses and miracles, so that Pharaoh could see who God's chosen people were. I've got a question for you today. Were they for Pharaoh? Or were they for God's chosen people to convince them who they were? Because they had forgotten. Pharaoh didn't know God's chosen people. The sad thing is, God's chosen people didn't even know they were God's chosen people. They had forgotten. Moses had to remind them who they were. They had to remind them who he was. And that he was there to lead them out of slavery. Sometimes I think it might have been a harder job for him to convince the people who they were than it was to convince Pharaoh to let them go. If you remember the years they spent there in the desert on their way to Canaan, over and over they kept forgetting who they were. They kept wanting to go back to Egypt. We had it better in Egypt. Over and over they kept questioning, who is this God? Who is this fellow Moses? They kept forgetting who God was and who Moses was. Why has he led us out here in the wilderness to die? Who is he? Who are we? Man, we had it good in Egypt. We had cucumbers. We had leeks and onions and garlic. We had food there. Here we are out here in the desert. We don't have water to drink, nothing to eat. Then he gives us this stupid manna. Wow. And they spoke against God, and they spoke against Moses, and over there were plagues or curses that fell on them, that a lot of the people were slain. At one point, when Moses was at the mountain, God told Moses, just get out of my way. I'm going to destroy them, and I'll make a new nation out of you. Just get out of my way. I've had it with them. I'm their God, and they don't even recognize me. They want to go back to Pharaoh like he's their God. Here we are today. Do you know who your God is? Do you know who you are? What have I been harping on? You are a chosen generation, a strange and peculiar people. Is there any doubt that we're a strange and peculiar people? If we're not doing something right. People look at us and, man, them Adventists are strange people. That's because we are. God has called us to be a strange and peculiar people. And he's called us to lead the people out of Egypt. Except there's another name used for Egypt. It's called Babylon. Remember, it's used simultaneously in the scriptures. Out of Egypt, out of Babylon. A lot of our people have gone into Babylon and they've forgotten who they are. If you remember, we've talked about in 1844, a group of people was started there. It's called the Last Day, the People of Judgment, the Seventh Church of Revelation. What were these people called? Adventist. And it wasn't a nice name they were calling us. They meant it in harm's way, them Adventists. Because what? We were teaching that Jesus was coming again. Now, how many churches, how many of the Protestant churches out there believe that Jesus is coming again? Most of them, right? If you believe that Jesus Christ is coming again, you are a what? You are an Adventist. I don't care what church you're going to, what denomination it is. If you believe that Jesus Christ is coming again, you're an Adventist. Now, I know you might have wandered off into Egypt or Babylon, and you've forgotten who you are or don't realize who you are. But if you believe that Jesus Christ is coming again, you are an Adventist. Don't stay in Egypt. Don't stay in Babylon. God has given the Seventh-day Adventist Church the three angels' message to call these people out of Egypt, out of Babylon. Go. Where did he tell us to go? Every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Tell the whole world. Look, if you believe in Jesus Christ and that he's coming again, you're one of my chosen people. You're an Adventist. Jesus said, I have sheep that are not of this fold. You must go and warn them. Call them out of those pastures, out of those sheep pen, to come join my chosen people, because they're Adventists. And I am coming again. And I want to take them with me. But they must come out of Egypt. They must come out of those pens that they've wandered off into and forgotten who they are. They don't even know why they're there. That is our mission impossible. To call them out. And sometimes we look at it and say, Lord, it's too big. It's too big. I don't know how to talk to these people. Remember, we're a strange and peculiar people. And that's what they think. And we're saying, Lord, there's giants in the land. They know we're strange and peculiar people. They ain't going to listen to us. God said, go. On the scripture I just used at prayer time, we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Was Moses able to lead the people out of Egypt? Not in his own might, not in his own power. Who does it say by whose hand it was done? By God's hand, his mighty hand and power. And he's spoken to us from that burning bush. He's spoken to us in our failure, because Jesus didn't come in 1844. Remember, there was a great disappointment. And he spoke to us among that great disappointment and said, I ain't through with you. I know you made a mistake here, but I can see now that you're a committed people. The ones that aren't committed have gone back to their own churches and they've done their own thing. But I know that you're a committed, you're a strange and peculiar people, and you're not afraid that people think that. I can use you to call my sheep back into the right pasture. I can call them out of Egypt. I can call them out of Babylon. You see, God said Babylon is going to be destroyed. And if you're part of Babylon, if you're not part of God's sheepfold, if you're there in Babylon, enjoying the leeks and the garlics and the cucumbers and the melons, and think we've got it good here. We can be safe here and we don't have to do anything. Now, them strange and peculiar people over there, they still think they have to do what God says. Duh. That's why we're a strange and peculiar people. Because Like in Revelation, it says we follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And we do whatever he tells us to do. And if they want to think we're a strange and peculiar people because of that, I could only wish that they were a strange and peculiar people. Because they're going to have to hear God's voice speaking through us. And come out of those churches, come out of Babylon that are teaching falsehood. Come out of Egypt. Because we're fixing to go to the promised land. Are you ready for the mission impossible that God's given you? Remember, we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Katrina has a closing song for us here, 146.